Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the digestive system. We're ready to go ahead and start swallowing and working our way through this alimentary canal. So we can imagine that we've gone through the mouth, that we've done some of that mechanical processing with our teeth, we've gone through the fauces and entered the pharynx. So this is the common passageway, is the pharynx. For both food and air. And of course, when we're thinking about the digestive system, we go back into the oropharynx, down into the laryngopharynx, and that takes us into the esophagus. The esophagus being the muscular tube, which works its way from the laryngopharynx down through the diaphragm to enter the stomach. When we think about the esophagus, it's going to be a little bit different than many of the other parts of the alimentary canal. Its job is simply to transport food from the pharynx to the stomach. There may be digestion, which is going to occur in this area. It ends up that digestion actually begins in the mouth. There is salivary amylase, ACE being the term we use, or the suffix we put on the end of a word to indicate that it's an enzyme. And we can begin digesting some of the starches, so that process can continue during this swallowing process, although of course it's a quick process of moving food down into the stomach. Now, in order to get into the stomach, we have to pass through that diaphragm, and we do through one of the many holes in the diaphragm. We obviously need a hole for the inferior vena cava, one for the aorta as it goes from being the descending thoracic aorta to the descending abdominal, and then the esophageal hiatus is the passageway for the esophagus to go through the diaphragm. This one is particularly important. It is a common site for what we call a hiatal hernia. The hiatal hernia is going to mean that this hiatus here is a little bit weak, that there can be movement in here, and it's possible for portions of this stomach to push their way through that hole and kind of get mixed up in here in the mediastinum adjacent to the heart and the lung. From what I've heard, that can be quite a painful thing. So as we go through the esophageal hiatus, we can be prepared to enter the stomach. We're going to do so by traveling through the cardiac sphincter here. So we want to think a little bit about what that means. And there are a couple ways we can think about that being the cardiac sphincter. First of all, it's a sphincter. It's thicker, smooth muscle in this area, which can help to squeeze that and keep contents of food in the stomach. Obviously, failures of that is going to allow food to move back up through here, getting into the esophagus, causing what we commonly refer to as heartburn, since the esophagus is posterior to or deep to the heart, and therefore we feel that burning in our chest where our heart is located. This can be a concern over time. This can potentially erode the lining of the esophagus, potentially even leading to esophageal cancer. I've seen one case of that in a cadaver, and basically the whole esophagus had lost its structural integrity, so the person was no longer able to use this for consuming food. But we want to think about that cardiac sphincter, and why is it called cardiac? Well, this region right here where the esophagus enters the stomach is the cardia of the stomach. We do have multiple regions, this dome being the fundus, this being the lesser curvature, most of this being the body, this being the greater curvature on this side, and then this kind of constricted region down here being the pylorus or pyloric region. So we can associate that with the cardiac region if we wish to, or we can just think about it as the sphincter that is closest to the heart, cardiac being one of the terms we use for heart, and it is the sphincter that would be associated with heartburn. So that does take us into the stomach. We commonly refer to the stomach as being J-shaped or comma-shaped. It is potentially a big sac. You can see right in here, this is a stomach from someone that has been using their stomach fairly recently. It's pretty big and stretched out. I've also seen stomachs that are very, very tightened up around themselves. Remember that it's a muscular organ. When we see cadavers, if they've been eating food, their stomach is pretty big. The gastric rugae, the folds that are inside of this, will not be very pronounced because the stomach is stretched out. But we might also see someone who really hasn't been eating much food in the weeks or months prior to dying, and that stomach will be very shrunken down and very wrinkly inside with those gastric rugae. So what is the role of this stomach? Well, it assists in mechanical churning or mechanical processing of food it can engage in maceration, and that's because it has 3 muscular layers. So we've got layers here, we've got kind of our longitudinal layer on the outside, a circular layer, and there's an oblique layer here as well. This just allows the stomach to mix food a little bit better than the other regions can. Now, it also produces hydrochloric acid down particularly within that pyloric region, and this helps to activate an enzyme which helps to digest proteins. So we refer to that as a proteolytic enzyme because it's going to break down proteins. So protein digestion really begins in the stomach here. And then, of course, we can also break down some of the connective tissue with that hydrochloric acid prior to passing that food through the pyloric sphincter at the end of that pyloric region into the duodenum. Now, we no longer refer to that really as food, but it's not feces yet either. So we have a term for this stuff that's in the stomach and that we pass into the intestine. We call that chyme. So chyme is kind of a mix of food that's partially digested, the stomach acids from the stomach, and as we pass that into the duodenum, we're going to add the bile from the liver and gallbladder, as well as the pancreatic juices from the pancreas. Those, of course, will help to neutralize the acidic nature of the chyme, as well as to add more enzymes to continue digesting things like starches that we started digesting with our salivary gland secretions, and proteins, which we started digesting in the stomach, but also to allow us to break down things like nucleic acids, other carbohydrates, and, of course, lipids, where the bile from the gallbladder will help to emulsify the lipids, to mix them in the water, and then enzymes from the duodenum and the pancreas will help us to actually break those down into their molecular components. So that, of course, does put us into the small intestine. We've dumped from the stomach into the small intestine as we went through that pyloric sphincter. By the way, the pyloric sphincter doesn't tend to have the same issues as the cardiac sphincter. The cardiac sphincter, of course, sometimes doesn't work quite right. It allows for movement from the stomach out. That might be burping, it might be vomiting, it might be heartburn. When the pyloric sphincter has problems, one of the problems it might actually have is being too narrow. We refer to that as pyloric stenosis, and that might not allow enough contents to come out of the stomach into the small intestine. Particularly, we might diagnose this in babies. They may regurgitate quite a bit because they're not able to process the food and move it from their stomach to the intestine. Now, as far as small intestine, it's all this kind of smooth-looking, squiggly stuff in here. It does have 3 main regions, and it is referred to as small because of its diameter, not its length. It ends up being the longest section of intestine. Now, as far as what's going on in here, this will be involved a little bit in digestion, but primarily in absorption, and therefore we increase surface area inside the small intestine to have more epithelium to better absorb the nutrients that we've broken down. There are 3 different levels of this increasing of surface area, which tells you kind of how serious that is. If you look inside this tube, you'll see these circular folds, or the fancy term for them is plicae circularis, which means circular folds. On top of each circular fold, and here is a single plica right here, we have multiple villi. Villi are finger-like projections. They are easily visible to the naked eye. They are macroscopic. And those villi, those projections, are going to be covered in that non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium, which of course has microvilli on that. So that is the 3rd microscopic level at which we are increasing surface area. So this whole thing is really set up to make sure that there is a ton of surface area for the absorption of nutrients. Now, within each of our villi, we may have multiple different kinds of vessels. So we want to kind of signify a particularly important one here. You can see here that we are bringing in an arteriole. We have a arterial end of a capillary network, the venous end of a capillary network. And within that cardiovascular capillary system, we're going to be picking up carbohydrates and proteins. But this lacteal, this lymphatic capillary here, is going to pick up the lipids that we bring across this epithelial surface here. So that actually helps explain why we refer to this as a lacteal. You can imagine that if we have this kind of milky-looking lymph within these vessels, because they are picking up lipids from our digestive tract, that somebody would look at that and say, hey, that's weird-looking lymph. It looks milky. To lactate is to produce milk, so lacteal is going to be the lymphatic capillary associated with the villi in our digestive tract. Now, we do need to learn the three sections of small intestine. They are the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and that's in order from proximal to distal. So here we see our first or proximal section. This is the duodenum right here. It is C-shaped. It is going to receive secretions from the common bile duct and the main pancreatic duct. The pancreas will actually kind of fit into that open end of the C right here and then kind of work its way. You can actually see it over here kind of behind the stomach. And so this is an area heavily involved in digestion because it is receiving food through the pyloric sphincter and then, of course, secretions which will help with that digestion process. It's also the shortest section of the small intestine, and it is retroperitoneal, meaning that it's covered by an adventitia. The second two sections are intraperitoneal. They have a serosa on the outside of them, and each one is a little bit longer than the next. So the jejunum is about 4 times as long as the duodenum, and the ileum is about twice as long as the jejunum. So the middle or second section here is the jejunum, primarily all about absorption. It has a lot of folds inside of this. We have more lymphatic tissue here inside the ileum, and it'll be the distal section. It's eventually going to meet up to the large intestine, which we see here being larger in diameter. So if we take kind of a quick look at the inside of these things, you'll see kind of plicae inside the duodenum, but they're really, really crazy inside the jejunum here. A little bit less noticeable plicae inside the ileum. But if we were to look in that wall in there, we'd see that in the duodenum, there's a lot of mucosal glands. We have less glandular structures within the jejunum, and the ileum here has what are referred to as Peyer's patches, which are lymphoid nodules. You can kind of think of them as the equivalent of maybe lymph nodes, but within our intestines to make sure that we can deal with any infections that might try to come across our intestinal wall. All right, next we have our ileocecal valve. Ileocecal valve here is kind of like the pyloric sphincter. It's a sphincter between the small intestine and large intestine. In this particular view, the large intestine, the cecum of the large intestine has been opened up, and we are looking at this mostly pinched closed ileocecal valve. If we were to go through that little hole, we would be entering the small intestine. Now, of course, we'd be going the wrong direction because food is going to come from the small intestine into the large intestine as it works its way towards our anus. So the large intestine is a little bit complex. It has the cecum and appendix on one end. It has a colon, which is broken up into a bunch of different sections. And then at the other end, there is the rectum terminating in the anal canal and the opening being referred to then as the anus. So what's so special or different about the large intestine? It's visually apparent that it's different than the small intestine. The small intestine is relatively smooth and smaller in diameter. This is larger in diameter. It has all these pouches, so it's kind of accordion-like. They are referred to as haustra, or alternatively as sacculations. And part of why they are there is because of this band here. There are actually 3 of these bands. All of the longitudinal smooth muscle on this large intestine is put into 3 distinct bands referred to as tenae coli, or one would be a tenia coli. So here's a single tenia coli, and these longitudinal bands of muscle being all bunched up mean that the contractions in this area are going to be a little bit different and to us sometimes more noticeable than the movements in the small intestine. So whereas we get peristalsis moving objects through the small intestine, we get something here sometimes referred to as mass peristalsis. So up in here we're going to be forming some feces, and we can get some pretty major contractions we might notice moving the feces down towards our rectum. So we can kind of experience pretty intense, let's say, movements of our bowels in this case. We also have associated with these omental appendices or epiploic appendages, which are these little fatty globs that hang off primarily of the Taenia coli here. And so these are what we might refer to as our visceral fat. We do actually have fat like this that kind of forms these same kinds of little globs in other places. If we do maintain a lot of fat inside our body cavity, we might see some associated with areas around the pericardium or other areas as well, but they're very common here on the large intestine. Now, as far as the regions of a large intestine, we do dump from the ileum into the cecum. This is a pouch essentially going the wrong direction. The cecum in humans is not particularly big, but some organisms will have a larger pouch, and they use this for bacterial fermentation. We'll actually get bacterial fermentation throughout our large intestine. And coming off the end of this is the appendix. So the appendix is sometimes referred to as a vestigial organ, and I think that that's a reasonable thing to do. It is shrunken down from the enlarged cecum or appendix of many organisms. It isn't gone, so maybe it still has some function, and it does have a large number of lymphatic nodules in this and can maybe act as a reservoir for bacteria, so we can recolonize this large intestine after, say, bouts of diarrhea, which will help to move both healthy and unhealthy bacteria out of ourselves. Interesting thing about the term vestigial organ, it doesn't necessarily mean that that structure doesn't have any function. It just means it doesn't have the function that it might have had in our evolutionary past, which would have been as a fermentation chamber. So we're going to move upwards, hopefully. If our feces are actually to get out of this area, we need to kind of follow this path. We're going to go up through the ascending colon on the right side of our body. Of course, as we get up high, we're going to hit the liver, so we have to have a turn. That turn is referred to as the right colic flexure or simply as the hepatic flexure. We then come across our transverse colon, which obviously moves transversely across the body, but again, it's going to hit the left-hand side. And as it does, we're going to have our left colic flexure or the splenic flexure. Interestingly, this shows both of these flexures at about 90 degrees. It's actually pretty common for them to be even more intense, where maybe it bends upwards and then kind of back down, almost making a 180-degree turn. But remember, it's a flexible tube. We then come down the descending colon on the left side of our body. Eventually, we're going to hit the ileum, not the ilium, but the bone ileum, I-L-I-U-M, and we're going to then have to curve towards the midline. This is going to be through what we call the sigmoid colon, and it's named for having an S shape. This actually looks kind of like the sigmoid colon that might be typical of females. There is variation in both male and females, but males often have a very large sigmoid, which will come up and kind of back down. As you might know, males don't have a uterus within their pelvic cavity. There's a little bit more room within this region than there is in females. So we get through that S-shaped sigmoid colon, and that will take us to the rectum. The rectum is an area here which, when it stretches, will communicate with the spinal cord, and that will initiate the defecation reflex, which will be a contraction of muscle in the rectum. And of course, the feces will come out through the anus during the process of defecation. Now, I just want to kind of talk about the direction of this thing real quick, using something I learned in Lamaze class when we were having our first child. They were teaching us that for colicky children, you can give them massages to help the gas come out. And basically, you'll work your way up here, up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, and through the sigmoid in kind of a curve across the body. But the key thing here for that baby is that you start on the right-hand side and you curve across and come down the left-hand side, because that massage is attempting to move gas through the large intestine to relieve gas pain. Now let's talk a little bit about the anus. And it's kind of weird to talk here about how can I avoid pooping, but that's kind of an important thing. I don't know about you, but I've had before this feeling that, wow, kind of need to poop, and yet been in a place where pooping maybe wouldn't be convenient at the time, right? So what do you have to do? You have to hold it. Well, this all relates, both for urination and for defecation, to how the muscles are set up that control those openings. So dealing with this with the defecation process, we can see the muscular wall of the rectum here. These are the anal canals here as we come down through. As we come down, we can see that the muscle thickens a little bit here, but it's still part of that rectal wall. This is the internal anal sphincter. This internal anal sphincter is going to open up as these rectal muscles contract because the rectum has been filled with feces. And again, this is a spinal cord level reflex. That's the I need to go and kind of I need to go right now feeling that we've had. Outside of this, though, we have the external anal sphincter. And this is skeletal muscle. This allows you to actually hold this. So you can say, well, I do have to go right now, but I can't go right now, so I'm going to go ahead and hold it. I use this voluntary skeletal muscle to constrict this, and unless you're going through a very severe bout of diarrhea, you can basically withstand the pressure of those contractions of the rectum, and eventually the muscles of the rectum and sigmoid colon are going to move those feces back out of the rectum. And that's important. They can move that all the way back up into the descending or even that kind of splenic flexure area. And that will relieve the pressure in the rectum so that the spinal cord will no longer signal for you to actually need to defecate. So the need to poop will go away. Now, the interesting thing about this, we can obviously avoid going, but how long can you do that for? We have to kind of go back and think about one of the functions that's really key to the large intestine. In addition to allowing for fermentation and some vitamin absorption, the large intestine is really about removing liquid from the feces, allowing the feces to form. And now we can think about this in the context of a couple of things. If I avoid pooping, and then that stuff moves up, and I go for a while without having to, and it moves back down again, and I avoid pooping again, I'm keeping it in my large intestine too long. It's going to dry out, and eventually I may not be able to get it out of there without, say, the help of an enema or something like that. So we can get constipation if we keep feces in our large intestine too long. Diarrhea, of course, would be the opposite of this. Because of usually some kind of bacteria in there that we shouldn't have, we get increased contractions, although this can come from nervousness as well. Increased contractions of our large intestine, moving the feces through it too quickly to where we're not able to pull enough liquid out. And of course, that means that diarrhea comes out as liquid and feces. All right, so this takes us into our accessory organs. We're going to begin here with the liver, which is obviously the largest visceral organ. The skin itself, of course, is a larger organ. But the largest organ here is on the right-hand side. It's in the upper right-hand quadrant, but it does come all the way across the midline with portions of its left lobe here. And of course, it has a lot of functions. If we think about what this liver does, it's involved in three basic things. Metabolic regulation. So it can store or mobilize nutrients. Primarily, it's going to store glycogen, and this is going to be in response to the secretion of insulin from the pancreas. It's also involved in hematological regulation, meaning regulation of the blood, and it does this in a lot of different ways. So it acts as a blood reservoir. It has a lot of venous capacity in it, so it's part of our venous reserve. It's going to be involved in filtration of blood, which is kind of a general concept. Normally we think about the kidney as doing that, but in this case, this might be the breakdown of worn out red blood cells, potentially even of some other structures that are in there, because we do have a designated set of phagocytic cells of macrophages within our liver. And also it synthesizes plasma proteins. It also is involved in synthesis and secretion of bile, not entirely independent of its hematological regulation, because it's actually going to use the pigments from the broken down red blood cells coming either through the splenic vein or from the breakdown of red blood cells in the liver itself. This bile will help to dilute the secretions from the stomach, the chyme that comes out of the stomach, help to buffer that and to emulsify the fats which are within it. So we could actually get much more specific and just say the liver really has a lot of jobs to do and kind of go at them one by one. You'll kind of come back and talk about some specific jobs in your physiology class. All right, liver has 4 lobes. It has left and right lobes. We can see those here. The left here is on the left, the right is on the right. We're actually looking at the underside of the liver as if we'd pulled our own liver out and then tilted it forward to look at the bottom of it. So that's the view. This is obviously the inferior vena cava. It would be posterior. We can then recognize that the other 2 minor lobes, the caudate and the quadrate, are each adjacent to a easily recognizable feature. The caudate, coming from caudal towards the tail end, is posterior. It's this lobe right here, and it's adjacent to the inferior vena cava. Whereas the quadrate, named for being square or rectangular, is right here next to the gallbladder, meaning it's more anterior. Now we do recognize from this anterior view, we see the right lobe on the left-hand side as if this is a patient's liver and we are viewing them head on, that we have this piece of mesentery acting as a ligament that divides it in 2. The right separated from the left by the falciform ligament here. Now you can see that there's also a coronary ligament along the top which helps to bind this to the diaphragm, so we're not addressing all the ligaments here. We do also want to take a look here though at the ligamentum teres, or round ligament. Of course we remember that teres means round. So the round ligament of the liver, not to be confused with the round ligament associated with the head of the femur or the round ligament associated with the uterus, is the remains of the umbilical vein, which brought blood here through the liver, trying to get towards that inferior vena cava. So we do actually have this potential to see the remains in an adult of their umbilical vein that they had when they were a developing fetus. Now we do have to also address the gallbladder here. The gallbladder is for bile storage. The liver produces bile. The gallbladder can only store it, but it is a muscular sac, and it's kind of on the right side of the liver, but on the underside of it. So the gallbladder here does sometimes produce something on its own, and that would be gallstones. It can form little stones in here. That may be a reason to remove the gallbladder, because if those stones are forced out in a contraction, they potentially could get stuck in some of these ducts which drain this area. The pancreas is another kind of key digestive gland. We remember that this one, of course, is also an endocrine gland, so it is a heterocrine or mixed gland, having both endocrine and exocrine function. The pancreas is a pretty ugly looking organ. It doesn't hold together very well either, so it's difficult to do surgery on. Does roughly follow the path of this splenic artery. In fact, sometimes the splenic artery may even kind of have pancreas growing around it, kind of forming a groove in the pancreas. But it sits here with its head in the C-shaped curve of the duodenum, and its tail end goes off towards that spleen that we see right here. So that is our pancreas, a really important digestive gland, but also the gland that produces insulin and glucagon to control our blood sugar levels. Now this is what we refer to as the biliary apparatus. The biliary apparatus is going to be draining bile from the liver and putting that into the duodenum. So basically it's a set of tubes that kind of make a pathway from the liver down to the duodenum. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but we can begin up here with the simple parts, with our right and our left hepatic ducts. Obviously in this case, left coming from the left side, right coming from the right side, hepatic because they are draining the liver. They drain into the common hepatic duct, which is also draining bile just from the liver. Now once we get down here, we can see that we could either go to the gallbladder or we could head down towards the duodenum. So our next ducts are going to be the cystic duct. Cystic duct is a two-way duct. It can fill the gallbladder, or if the gallbladder contracts, it can take bile from the gallbladder down towards the duodenum. Kind of gives us that gallbladder as a reservoir for when we eat a high-fat meal and we need more bile. The common bile duct then can carry bile which has come directly from the liver, or more recently from the gallbladder, because the cystic and common hepatic duct join to form the common bile duct. It's also the longest of our ducts. It is going to run posterior to the stomach into the pancreas, and ultimately within this muscular wall of the duodenum, it's going to join to this main duct of the pancreas prior to dumping out through this little hole here. So let's take a look at those features. We have two features here, the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the hepatopancreatic sphincter, depending on which object we want to take a look at, and the major duodenal papilla. So we have our common bile duct coming down. It joins to this main duct from the pancreas. You can see why we call that the main pancreatic duct. There's a little side duct here potentially, although all of this is totally up in the air because of individual variation. We have a place in here where the common bile duct comes down. It has a sphincter around it, and that pancreatic duct comes in. We are in the muscular wall of the duodenum, and there's a place where those two tubes join together. That's the hepatopancreatic ampulla. In fact, an ampulla is going to be a place like this where we have two tubes joined together. We have another one that we can see this semester, which is going to be where the seminal glands and the vas deferens meet. And then we dump out into the duodenum through this duodenal papilla. We do sometimes call this the major duodenal papilla because obviously there could be another one here where another duct comes in. Now, just as a side note on human variation, some people have a very large hepatopancreatic ampulla. Some people have a very short one. Some people don't have one at all because the common bile duct and the main pancreatic duct never actually join together. So the interesting thing about being a surgeon, of course, is that we have anatomy that is pretty conservative and the same from everybody, from one person to the next. And we have other cases where you just kind of need to go in there and check and see what you're dealing with.